All right, I think we're probably just going to go ahead and get started. So thank you for coming to this session. This is Measuring Emissions While Managing for Impact in an Inherently Chaotic World. So my name's Imogen. I'm with Brendle Group, a consultancy firm based in Fort Collins, Colorado. And this panel basically came out of some conversations that we've had kind of internally at Brendle Group and then also with each other about the complexities of greenhouse gas emissions inventories. And we just decided kind of to take that conversation public and share some of our ideas that we've had along the way, and then maybe also learn from you guys at the end if we have some time for kind of some back and forth Q&A. So as far as kind of the main topics that we're hoping to cover, we just wanted to share in the challenging decisions about what to include in greenhouse gas emissions inventories. It's just recognizing that there's lots of decisions that are made along the way that impact kind of the outputs that you get out of your inventory and then how that's used within the community. To discuss the imperfect and incomplete picture that inventories provide. And then to reflect on the power of greenhouse gas emissions inventories as a tool for storytelling, for identifying priorities and inspiring change, even in a world that's inherently chaotic and interconnected. And so I'll start again. I mentioned I'm Imogen Ainsworth. I'm with Brendle Group. I live in about 4 miles from Salida in Poncha Springs. And our company, Brendle Group, is based in Fort Collins, and we have a mission to accelerate equitable solutions to the climate crisis. And then our purpose is to apply our engineering and consulting talents to create lasting impacts that sustain and inspire our communities and our world. So next, I'm just going to kind of open it up with a question for each of our panelists. And so we talked a bit about emissions inventories and how determining the scope of inventories can often feel a bit more like art than science. Particularly, I think, in mountain communities that are highly visited and kind of have inherently porous boundaries. So people coming out in and out all the time. So maybe just for each, and we'll start with Alexi. Just can you describe the scope of your last inventory? Maybe tell us a bit about your town and just introduce yourself as well.
Okay, sure. I'm Alexi Lamm. I've worked at the city of Moab for about 2 years. Moab is in southeastern Utah. If you haven't been there, we have a couple national parks, Canyonlands Arches, Colorado River, a lot of other places for mountain biking, off-roading. So those are a lot of our visitors are coming for those reasons. We have about 5,000 full-time residents, but if you do count visits, like not people, but people who have visited things, it's about 3 million people a year. So the proportion of people who are visiting to the people who live there is very off kilter, I guess. It's always nice in January when you can recognize people in the grocery store, because that's our off season. So our emission inventories started in 2019, and we had to do some reporting at that point. For mountain towns, we also needed inventories for things like the Utah Renewable Communities. So that was the first one. And strangely enough, Moab doesn't actually have an inventory. Our county does, and we collect it and we use it. And I think this just came out of a need for resources. We were both doing all of these things at the same time. We both needed an inventory at the same time. And a lot of our data ended up being at the county level. So we have, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, but our boundaries are actually at the county. And then we'll talk about it later, but we do a little finagling with the numbers to try to zero in on what our city emissions are.
All right, let's go, I think, next to Marty.
All right, my name is Marty Poole. I'm the sustainability manager for the city of Durango. Durango is a community of about 20,000 people in southwest Colorado. We are located in La Plata County, which is about 70,000 people, and we are the largest community in that region of southwest Colorado that's kind of bounded by the San Juan Mountains, and so we're a little isolated in that way. We're also very close to the New Mexico. We're also I'm coming through. All right, so we're very close to the New Mexico border. We actually have a lot of commuting between the two. Really gotta just, all right, it's, yeah. Very close to the New Mexico border. We're nearby to the two Native American reservations, the Mountain Utes and the Southern Utes, and also very close to Mesa Verde. and it's kind of a very mixed demographic, socioeconomically, industry. We're maybe not as driven by tourism as other communities, but we certainly visitation and tourism is a part of what we do. I wouldn't call. I want to switch. Yeah. It is all right. Oh, that's so much better. Retire that one. Recycle it. I would say we're not as much of a resort community as maybe some other communities here. For our inventory, it's very different than Alexi's situation. We are just bounded by city boundaries in our inventory, and I think this isn't just for our inventory, but I in some ways struggle for sustainability or climate action engagement right now anywhere beyond the city. So we don't have a lot of action from our county. We don't have a lot of action from neighboring smaller communities or neighboring counties. And so that boundary decision is really kind of comes down to budget and jurisdictional scope, and really like this of why would we spend city dollars investigating something beyond city limits is sort of the implicit direction I get sometimes. And so, yeah, kind of a contrasting situation to Alexi's.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dannah. I'm the sustainability coordinator for the town of Crested Butte. I've been in my position for a little over a year now. Crested Butte is a ski resort community and a historic mining town. We, I think, have reached about 1,700 whole people full-time. Look out. I think what makes us a little bit more unique than maybe some other mountain town communities is we're especially isolated, and our community is really tied to hanging on to what we call our rough edges, meaning they're really interested in preserving our 1960s ski town era vibe, which is why I think Crested Butte has been labeled as like the last great ski town, no offense to any other ski towns, as well as our historic mining history. So we have had some previous inventories from 2009 when we kind of had like this very ad hoc sustainability position. We also did one in 2019 in partnership with Western Colorado University. And then we did one again for our most recent climate action plan, which we're developing in 2022. We really decided the scope by going to council and saying, do we want this to be more of a sustainability plan as we move forward, where we are maybe thinking about things that would be considered more scope 3 emissions, and kind of reaching beyond the boundary of just the town, which is 1 whole square mile wide. Or are we going to really focus in on emissions? And the direction we really got was kind of similar to what Marty was just saying. Let's focus on what we can control in our jurisdiction and leverage regional initiatives to do more scope 3 projects. So it was really interesting because the prior 2 emissions inventories had been completed under very wildly different protocols. So that was really challenging when we did our emissions inventory. We actually worked with Brendle Group to help backcast a little bit to make those comparable and useful. So,
Thanks, Dannah. Okay, maybe before we go on, just put your hand up if you've ever created a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Okay. And put your hand, keep them up. And then put your hand down if you had never had trouble with the transportation emissions piece of the inventory. So keep it up if you have had trouble. Okay, most people have had trouble with the transportation piece. So we thought we'd spend just a few minutes, maybe a couple of questions on the transportation piece specifically. I just attended the presentation about the aviation emissions and the sustainable aviation fuels and found that really interesting. So each of your communities has an airport, either in the community or nearby to the community. And just curious how you, if and how you factored in the airport emissions into your community inventories. And maybe we'll just start at this end and go down.
we did not. The Gunnison Airport is very much county managed in its own entity, and as I mentioned before, our council is pretty clear on let's focus in where our money basically can have the most impact, recognizing that we can continue to have conversations regionally that might impact the airport, but not a focus.
And we actually have a municipally operated airport that is outside of city boundaries. So if you want to nerd out on protocol, it is not included, or no, it's 50% included in our community-wide inventory because we're attributing 50% of those visits to coming into Durango, and then the remaining going to the county or regional area. But then in our municipal inventory, 100% of those emissions are included. And so kind of the nuance of explaining, and I think we'll get into this further in the conversation, but sometimes that nitty gritty, like here's how the protocols work and how it makes the percentages and numbers look and everything. Sometimes you run into a situation like this that's so confusing, it's almost not, you have to be careful that it doesn't detract from the conversation in its confusingness, right? When people are like, wait, 20% doesn't equal 15% over here, and you're like, don't worry about that. Like, think a little bigger picture on this. So it's kind of a unique situation for us, but certainly transportation, the airport is by far the most emissions on our municipal scope, far and away, and but then it makes up kind of a similar percent of emissions that you would expect for a community when you look at our community-wide inventory. So it's kind of creates an interesting way of presenting that information to council members and the public.
All right, we have 3 different communities and 3 different ways to do this. We do have a county inventory, and we do include it, and we even include it when we're looking at our city. And the reason we do that is because the county population is about 10,000. Half of them live inside the city limits. A good other portion of them live right outside Moab and Spanish Valley. A lot of people using that airport are coming to visit Moab. So I think you'll hear over and over again, some of the things we're thinking about are, what is our direct impact? And do we care about that? What can we influence and how can we change it? And then what do we have resources or data to measure? Because sometimes we do have influence and we have impact and it's really hard to measure. So the airport kind of falls into, it is part of our impact. It's not something we have a lot of influence over, but at some point, if we do have, ways to do that, and we work with the county a lot because we're a small community in a rural place, we want to know what they are, just so, 1, we can measure our impact, and 2, when we have opportunities, we want to be able to take advantage of it.
So maybe staying on the transportation theme, but turning to kind of the on-road component of that. So Crested Butte is small, compact, and has already an extremely high rate of walking and biking within the town limits. And so the in-boundary kind of transportation emissions in your inventory is pretty small. But there is a significant amount of commuting that happens within the valley, down to Gunnison, up to Mount Crested Butte, and then also visitors coming in from all over the world. So maybe just take a few minutes to kind of describe how you approach the on-road transportation and whether there was any kind of balances that you made in that.
Yeah, like I said, our directive was really to focus in on Scope 1 and Scope 2, and limited Scope 3. And we really were trying to focus on what was in boundaries. So our transportation emissions, again, that kind of storytelling piece, we recognize that a lot of people do commute up into the northern part of our valley for work. But there are more regional issues that the town isn't necessarily directly responsible for it, in ways that we can work with partners to change those emissions. So we decided to just include what was in the boundary, which has been interesting to look at. Again, understanding that most of our community members do walk or bike most of the time. Wanted to add something about that. We also had a really unique planning year in Crested Butte. We had 4 municipal planning efforts happening all at the same time. One that immediately came before the climate action plan was what we're calling our transportation mobility plan. That was really interesting because we adopted this plan that essentially recommends what a climate action plan would for regional transportation. That's de-emphasizing single occupancy vehicles, providing alternative modes of transportation, supporting our partners in our municipality and electrifying transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So we really felt like regionally and within our town, we kind of were already addressing those things, even though we didn't explicitly measure that scope 3 emission. So kind of a unique take on it. I don't know how it's received, but that's our direction.
I think one of the valuable experiences from doing a greenhouse gas inventory overall is you learn the protocols and the calculations and the equations and really like the key variables that go into those equations, and you say, oh wow, like if I tweak electrical the emissions factor on the grid, this is the impact that it has, right? Or you could adjust kilowatt hours consumed. And so in transportation, there's a few key variables there, some of which we have some influence on, like, vehicle fuel efficiency if we're doing some programs to push for more or electric vehicles. But like general fuel efficiency of vehicles across what people can buy in the United States is like not something that we're going to control, right? And so you start to hone in on those pieces of data points that you want to get better at collecting. Sometimes you have to use, data sets that are okay, not great. Sometimes you have really refined data sets. And so I think on transportation, what was clear to us was the number of electric vehicles in our community, because you can just see the direct impact that those have on the calculation, and then also vehicle miles traveled, VMT. Raise your hand if you have figured out how to accurately track VMT in your community, because I want to talk to you. It's a hard nut to crack. It requires a lot of assumptions, and that I was not kidding. Like literally, if you figured that out, please come talk to me. And so, are there some assumptions? We actually ended up just not changing our VMT between 2016 and 2022 between our two inventories. And I got some pushback from that because people are like, what do you mean that hasn't changed? And I was like, well, it probably has changed, but I can't point to any data set that I can, reliably reference to articulate that change. So it's brought up some really good conversations with our council, with our amazing transportation department and multimodal specialists about like, look, okay, this is clearly an important data set that we want to track to show the impact that all of these multimodal and transit programs are having. Like, let's take some time and put some effort into that for refining our future inventories. So it kind of shows some of that, where that data is and isn't available sometimes.
Let's see. Okay, so transportation in Moab, we use the Utah Department of Transportation numbers for our transportation and our inventory. It does include some things that aren't especially helpful. Main Street is a highway. It also is a trucking corridor. Moab is a city located where it is because it's a really great place to cross the Colorado River. If you think about up and downstream, there aren't a lot of good crossings. So we have a lot of trucking traffic coming through. And then in the county, which we use the county inventory, there's an interstate, and those people definitely have the option not to stop in Moab. So when we're looking at it for a city level, we cut out I-70. If they are going to come into the city, they'll get on a different road, and we'll be able to see them there. And then we have toyed around with including our Main Street highway and not, because those people are also other places in town. And in cutting out 191 or Main Street and I-70 moves our greenhouse gases in transportation from like 2/3 to 1/5. It's huge, and it makes a really big difference when we're looking at our inventory for like things we can influence, because it makes everything else look tiny if we include those two things. And when we take them out, you can see like buildings and other things and places that we can make a difference. So right now we have bounds. We know transportation is somewhere in this range. It's probably more than 21% and less than 67. 21 is more helpful for us because it is something we could work with, and it's streets that we know that we have some control over, and it also lets us see efforts we've made in other areas.
We could probably keep talking about the kind of nerdy calculation of inventories, and maybe we will again when we get to the Q&A, but we wanted to kind of like zoom out a little bit or zoom forward and think about the way that these technical questions about what to include or not to include in emissions inventories are a balance between the sphere of influence of the community, data availability and quality, community expectations, and the level of effort that all impact kind of what comes out of the other end. And we also wanted to reflect on the fact that greenhouse gas emissions inventories are ultimately tools for tracking change over time, but also for telling the story about the community's inventories and thinking about where to prioritize action. So the next kind of set of questions are going to revolve around that. So for Crested Butte, I know that you're kind of in the process of developing the 2030 climate action plan, but maybe just I guess the question is, how is your emissions inventory feeding into your prioritization or your identification of actions within the community?
Our council is really interested in seeing both what our most highest emitting sectors were, which unsurprisingly were our buildings, and more specifically residential buildings. But another piece that they were asking for was like a cost-benefit analysis. They wanted to know where we could kind of put the least amount of money for the most amount of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So coincidentally, thanks to our inventory, that also was buildings. So I think the inventory is just really informing for council in a few different ways what we can prioritize in the near term and where we can take the biggest chunk out of emissions because that is such a priority for our community.
Sorry. I think, and I'm gonna let you answer that question, but also add on so that I don't lose the microphone down the other end. So maybe, for the two of you, the same question, but maybe for Durango specifically, because you've had like multiple years of inventories now, thinking about how it was helpful the first time. You've had a bit like longer between to implement some actions. So whether there's any kind of key priorities that you've seen emerge so far. And then I know, Alexi, for Moab, you've talked a bit about the different legislative landscape in Utah compared to the rest of us are in Colorado. So maybe answering the same question and then also reflecting a bit on how that limits or doesn't your ability to act.
I think just to echo the points, I always come back to, if some of you are familiar with the model of the sphere of influence, the sphere of concern, the sphere of influence, and the sphere of control, if anyone's seen that Venn diagram, right? And so I think we get a lot of community members and even sometimes counselors that are talking in terms of the sphere of concern, right? And like ocean plastic waste. I was like, yes, that is a problem. I'm not working on it because I live in Durango. And so you have the sphere of concern, then the sphere of influence. So I think of that also a little geographically, influencing regional issues, working with the county to, when we are able, or coalitions to the state. And then the sphere of direct control, which I think is, in my experience, and it sounds like Alexi and Dannah as well, it seems to be where the GHG inventories are the most helpful, right? Is taking limited resources and capacity and saying, what can we do as a community? What do we have control over, given this data that we have, to have an impact? And our methane and well emissions, a huge issue in our region? Absolutely. Does City of Durango directly have jurisdiction over that? No. And that's frustrating from a holistic change standpoint, but from a honing in and focusing where you can have control and where you can use your limited resources, these inventories are really helpful. And then to the point about multiple inventories, and also sometimes when you have changes in slight changes in protocols or percentages, I remind people don't worry if it's 35% or 32% or what, those little, there's a margin of error in some of these calculations depending on the accuracy of your data sets. But buried under those high level numbers are these really important calculations, which I mentioned earlier, where you see the key variables, and then you can back out this high level understanding and then get down a few layers further and say oh, okay, if energy is our top category, and then it's buildings, and then it's this, and then it's that, we're going to do a free thermostat replacement program, because you follow that chain of connection between energy of our top category and this very cheap and easy way to get people to use less energy in their buildings. And so that's like that direct line between the information from the inventory to like these specific program and decisions that we're making.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that a lot of the way this is useful is by looking at priorities and trying to figure out where you can influence things. And one of the reasons so we did this consultant-based inventory in 2019 with 2018 data with the county. And one of the reasons our next inventory 3 years later used the same scope was so we could compare, even though the city was entirely compiling it. Because also I had just started this job and the city was waiting on the sustainability plan. And in order to get to a sustainability plan, we needed a greenhouse gas inventory to help with those priorities. So 2025, we'll be doing one with 2024 data, and I think in that one, we're going to have a county level one again, because we still need to compare, and then we're going to also have a city level one, so we have some idea what we're actually doing. With that, I think when we get into those priorities, one of the things that I know has come up in other sessions I've been, when I was at this conference last year, home rule versus state set energy codes. There are things you can control and things you can't. And we wanted to touch on that a little bit. So energy, obviously, is a big source of greenhouse gases in a lot of our communities, and including Moab. And there's a limit to what we can do, because in Utah, the state sets those codes. There are a few things that you can do, right? Stretch codes, it's expensive to develop, and we do find those challenging because it's hard to find an incentive that's big enough to make it worthwhile. So it's something that we're interested in and still trying to explore. I know other places in Utah, I've had some conversations, are also doing this and exploring it. And something else that we have been able to do more immediately is work with our Association of Governments that does our weatherization program. So we applied for Buildings Up funds, the prize through the DOE, and within that, we received funding to expand the weatherization and energy efficiency program to include more things for more people. And those are some areas that we've been able to work, because our Association of Governments is based out of another city in another county, and they've been having trouble getting into our community. So we took that opportunity to invite them in and say, we are going to help you, and we're going to try to connect you to some people, and we got you some money. And those are some places that we have been able to make a difference.
Thanks. Maybe on the flip side of that, then, so there's the use of inventories and identifying kind of where the levers are for direct impact on emissions. In the development of these inventories and kind of that balance between availability of data and effort and data quality, there are things that are not included that do also have real impact or emissions beyond the boundary. So maybe like full accounting for for scope 3 visitor emissions, or kind of upstream materials emissions of goods and services consumed within the community are not always accounted for explicitly in inventories. I'm curious how you are managing these things, if and how you're managing these things that are not measured in your inventories, and then how you're showing kind of measurable or tracking impact in those pieces as well.
I had something written down, but I don't think I like what I wrote down. So I'll just kind of go back to, we're a little unique because regionally there's a lot going on in our valley, in the Gunnison Valley, with the city of Gunnison, the county, Mount Crested Butte up the way, that I think really digs deep at the like scope 3 and kind of broader scope emissions. We're writing a community plan, which we won't be measuring, but it's essentially an infill study. We're trying to figure out how to get people and essential goods and services to live where they work, which will be huge on emissions, maybe not immediately, but over time. Corridor planning and talking about roundabouts and improved transportation for housing developments that are going in the valley. So I guess maybe to directly answer your question, it's hard as a municipality to take it on under one climate action plan. And I think that we kind of address those things in partnerships, right? Like the town of Crested Butte is 1 square mile wide, and we have a set budget, and we can't just do it all by ourselves, especially for issues that are affecting us valley-wide. So maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, scope 3 is really challenging. just from a data availability, and then trying to really, I mean, there's the protocols for how you draw those boundaries, but I mean, scope 3 could include everything that everyone is buying in your community. It's like, how would you ever get that data? And also then like what policy is going to go in place that affects that? And I'm not like, these are all issues that we can all be working on. I mean, I know there's a lot of people working in the area of like reuse and tackling fast fashion, but that's just like, is that going to be, are we going to put all the time into getting that data and tracking that information? Like, are we going to do anything with that data? And I think a lot of things fall into that when it comes to scope 3, and it can be hard because you don't want to say that this thing isn't important, but you do have to just acknowledge that like limit of time and resources and data availability. I think one thing that really comes to mind that I really want to hone in on in the next inventory is the emissions associated with construction. I mean, we have a very vocal citizen who I very much appreciate, that every time we pour some concrete down, he's always sending, calculations to me and council about the emissions associated with that concrete. And that's an important conversation, and what is the trade-off between a concrete bike path that's 3 miles long out to a new development versus the biking mobility that will then provide. I mean, that's an important conversation about what we're doing around climate action planning. So I would say construction and especially cement and concrete.
So I started with saying that we wanted a greenhouse gas inventory for a sustainability plan, but we also did put together a sustainability plan. And when we asked our residents what was important to them, they were interested in urban agriculture, composting, green stormwater infrastructure, preserving natural space, and green, I'm trying to think, I'm missing one. Urban forest, our canopy. And then we had one out of our 6 top priorities that was energy efficiency. That means that our sustainability plan is measured in a lot of metrics that aren't a greenhouse gas inventory. It includes like dark sky readings. We recently became a dark sky community. It includes urban forest, canopy coverage, includes water, which is life and death in the desert, not just because of like the water table, but also because of flash flooding. So I think the greenhouse gas inventory has become a very important metric. We do have these goals, but it's just one of many that we use.
I might ask another question that's slightly off script, but not that off script. No pressure. About leadership. So I think another way that all of your communities are having an influence on emissions beyond your boundary is through like leadership and advocacy. I know that Crested Butte has identified like demonstrating what mountain communities can do as kind of a parallel goal in the climate action plan. Durango's, you work a lot with the utility that has impact beyond the community, and then in Moab, you're kind of a founding partner and an influencer on some of the activities that are happening statewide. So maybe just for each of you sort of reflecting on how you see your role as a leader or as an incubator of scalable solutions and an advocate for change beyond your boundaries as well.
Yeah, I think we've become, I don't want to like boast too loudly, but kind of a global leader in electrification because we were so aggressive with our new building above code requirements, which is really hard to pass. And I think we really only have the ability to do that because we are such a teeny tiny community. So we can propose bold solutions. And we also have a really great document in our town. It's our community compass, which is our strategic plan, but it really identifies the values we have as a community for decision making as opposed to laying out what's going to happen over the next 10 years. And one of those is to be a bold community. So like our community is on board with that in being bold. And I mean, I feel like communities are looking at Crested Butte to see what happens with this new building code, and we've had bumps along the way, trust me. But we can lead because we're kind of in the global eye, and that's not unique to Crested Butte. All of these ski towns, we have global visitors from all over that take away that message, and so I think even though it may not feel like we have this gigantic impact, I think we actually really do.
I need a second to collect my thoughts a little bit.
Yeah, I do think that our small communities have an outsized impact, not just because everybody who comes to the community is producing greenhouse gases and making our inventories, inflating them, but we do have influence. I think for Moab, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a way to characterize the climate there, because I feel like it's not specifically like action bold, but it is creative. And I think, again, similar point, being small lets the city be creative, well-timed within the legislative, session, of course, preferably after. And then that lets a small community explore some of these ideas, and then it lets other people see them when they're visiting as well.
I have to remind myself in my answer that I don't think anyone from Durango is here, so maybe I can be a little more candid. So I think we go through ebbs and flows with council leadership or regional relationships, where sometimes a community can really, I'm hearing stories and seeing in some of these sessions about these amazing collaborations between the city and the county and multiple counties, and I'm so jealous of Garfield Clean Energy and Clear. Like, every time I see their presentations, I'm like, oh, that's amazing. But so those are possible, and I think the kind of keystone communities in a region have, in my view, a responsibility to be those leaders and the conveners. Is Durango doing that right now? No, like, not particularly in my view. Has it done it in the past? Yeah. Will we do it in the future? Yeah. So I think, my vision is to start again with this boundary and scope of control to scope of influence. Is I really hope that every time I have to say to someone, well, this inventory just covers city limits, and then a community member says, well, what about all the oil and gas just to the south of us? And I was like, what about all the oil and gas just to the south of us? Maybe our county commissioner should be included in this process, and I think it just, when you have the gaps in what's being measured or what's being talked about, people start to connect the dots, and whether it's a council member or a coalition of community members, they start to see oh, this issue doesn't just end at city limits. We really need to push the county to get more on board. And I'm really not trying to trash the county. They have tons of great staff that are working super hard, and there's all kinds of reasons that maybe they haven't been able to be involved up to this point. But yeah, so I think it starts the conversation of where is this next coalition of people that can be involved. And then I'll just end on a quick note about the importance of these multiple community. I heard about, Utah Renewables Coalition, and then ours in Colorado is called Colorado Communities for Climate Action, CC4CA, and being a part of those coalitions is invaluable. And our GHG inventory includes that importance of those statewide coalitions.
Cool. Sorry for the curveball. I think maybe one last question, and then we can open it for any questions that you all have. But something that I think about a lot, and I think probably all of us in the small towns who are creating these kinds of inventories or managing climate action have thought about at some point, is just, we're small. Durango is about 19,000 people. It's the largest community on this row. So our emissions are small. Even if we get to zero, it's tiny. And so I think, and then even of those emissions, the potential for direct impact as a municipality is kind of a fraction even of those. And so maybe just to close, just if you could share any thoughts that you have on this conundrum and kind of why you continue to create inventories and to track the impact of those over time.
Yeah, I'll just maybe point back to what I said, is that we're a global community. People come and visit our communities and see what we're doing, and maybe can take that back to their communities. I also am very firm in my belief that if you tell people that their actions don't matter, they don't. And that is not a helpful narrative in in the world that we're in right now. Everybody needs to do everything that they feel makes an impact. And so it's up to us to set that example and say, yeah, we're tiny. I think our emissions inventory in this last one, we had like 23,000 metric tons, which is nothing compared to like Walmart. Walmart's doing more than Crested Butte is. But we can't just say we don't matter. That's not helpful.
Yeah, I mean, showing what's possible is that then as soon as you begin to show things are possible, then everyone's like, you create a new like reality, right? Like everyone's like, oh yeah, it's possible. Like when Crested Butte passed their all electric and building code ordinances, like I bring that up all the time in conversations or mentions to council, like other communities are doing this. And then if we all start to do it, then those other larger communities or maybe more purple or even more conservative communities say like, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. And it made financial sense and it didn't tank that community's economy. So you're showing what's possible. And then I'll just also, prior to this, I worked in higher ed and I would get this question a lot from students, this like, what even matters, And I remember we did an event with a philosophy professor, and he said, well, I mean, if you want to go down that route, that's nihilism, and if you want to be a nihilist, I'll explain to you the ethics of nihilism, and you can decide if that's for you, and like what we do matters, right? Like, and yeah, just that idea of like going down that route of like my influence is small, so nothing I do matters is just such a. That's not the ethic that I live by, and I don't think it's the ethic that most people in the world live by. And so, just to like extend that pragmatically to a bunch of numbers on a page with a greenhouse gas inventory, it's just like it's not a helpful perspective, and it just puts you in a weird place philosophically in this world if you go down that route. So I reject nihilism.
Yeah, I think all those things are true. We're rural, we drive a lot. Like, even if we are objectively small, our impacts are disproportionate per person. But more than that, I don't think that's exactly why we do it. I think when you are in Jackson or in Moab, like you come and you get inspired by the mountains or the rusty rocks, and that's why we live in these places, and we see the effects of climate change and like the wonder that the nature around us like inspires in us firsthand all the time. And I think we're driven to do it for that very reason. Like we see the effects of what we do, we live with it, and we want to do something about it.
Any questions?
Super exciting co-benefit.
I'll let you go.
Yay. Like e-bikes, equity, transportation access. I mean, there are things, I think there have been missteps in the sustainability movement at time where, you're asking for only like the most affluent people to reduce their consumption, which is an important route to take because the highest affluence also has the highest environmental impact and greenhouse gas impact. But also there are things that you can do that are programs where we have an e-bike rebate program. It's been super popular, super successful. Some of those bikes are going to people that have two vehicles and are now choosing to do this because it's a quality of life benefit. It reduces their emissions. It's just more fun or all those reasons. And some of those bikes are going to people that don't have a vehicle. And so those bikes are not really having any type of climate impact, right? If anything, they're having like a marginal climate increase. Tiny. But like now that person can get to their job so much easier or take their kid to school, and those stories in my mind have actually been like the more heartening ones than like the person's like, I don't drive my car as much and now my emissions are half of what they used to be. I'm like, that's nice. But now this single mom is like taking her kid to school. And so you can have these programs that do both, right? So.
Yeah. That is how we ended up in our sustainability plan, having like 5 out of 6 top priorities not be directly energy or transportation related, is the co-benefits. It's hot in southeastern Utah. The urban tree canopy and natural spaces are really important to people to help with cooling down that space to live in. That also is coming into play because if you've seen Moab on the news lately, it might have been because we had 3 flash floods this summer. And having, again, those natural corridors are important to people's safety and quality of life. So when we did do our sustainability plan, the impact on our greenhouse gas goals was one of the things that we were measuring against. But it was also looking at how people in the community felt about it and those other kinds of co-benefits that they might bring to our community.
I'll just add that there are other compelling arguments to reduce emissions. There are lots of people, even council members, that don't care about reducing emissions. I mean, one of the biggest messages I took away from Mountain Towns last year was stop talking about emissions and start talking about public health. And I think public health it's a way, and we were talking this morning about kind of crossing the aisle, conserve, whatever way you lean. It's a great common denominator beyond just let's do good for the planet. It's good for people too. So that's why we included co-benefits.
Yeah, in the Moab sustainability plan, it's like the emissions are a co-benefit almost. So it's like leading with what people said they cared about, and then emissions is kind of like do no harm or like, yeah. Let's go back.
That's a really tough question, and I'll just share maybe a little bit about my experience in developing our inventory. Having stepped into this role just fairly recently, I think that one, as an elected official, you got to trust your staff. I think that we can go back to the consultants we're working, right? It's our job to help manage the consultants and say, this doesn't feel right. I don't really feel like this data set represents our community. In several instances, some of the, I think the gentleman who mentioned, there's county data. Sometimes their margin of error is like the size of Crested Butte. So it's like, that doesn't represent us at all. I think in our case, what we had to do is we did have very different methodologies, and our mayor basically told us in the middle of developing the inventory, this is kind of crap. Like, because the inventories are so different, we're just going to lean into the inventories are kind of rough, so I guess we're just going to move forward. There are ways to go back and maybe normalize some of that data so that you can bring what was best practice then into what is best practice now and get a better picture. I don't want to spread the message that greenhouse gas emissions inventories are trash, because there are some questions about methodologies. I think it's improving over time. This is a relatively new science, really, measuring emissions. And so we get better every year in global protocols, and how the standards that we're all meeting to measure these things are becoming more consistent. I think the inconsistency of how we each measure that in our community hopefully is improving. So I would say, just to summarize, trust your staff. And if you're feeling like the data doesn't feel right to the community, there are ways to go back and figure out what makes sense for us. That's my take.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. It's an iterative process. And in our most recent one, we used some pretty different methodology for waste, for instance. And a couple of we had some pushback on that because our percentages showed our local composting company was the one that pushing back, because it said that our waste emissions were even less than we had previously thought. And then that hurts their message of saying, composting is an important climate action, because now waste is 3% of our inventory. And so, I mean, those conversations are hard, but I would say our very next one, we are going to take more time and dig into the waste, and then back out and be transparent about what that process was and why we, what we've refined and why we're that much more confident this next time around. And each time that margin of error and the data sets, you can refine it here, you can refine it there, and it gets better and better at time. But just because you have some margins of error in the overall process doesn't make it a useless tool. The big picture direction that these plans give to our decision making and where we allocate resources is super valuable. And you can take, you have some errors when you do these big overarching inventories, but there you can be very granular with the bottom up impacts of various programs. And so, you take those data sets and you start to merge them all. And as you work on these progress, you can pull this data together, and it just gets better and better. And so it is a tool for, we're starting with the premise that we should be doing something with climate change, right? And assuming that premise, what are your tools and what is going to guide that action? A greenhouse gas inventory is a necessary tool in the playbook of, or the toolkit, the play tools. I don't know. Anyway, it's a necessary tool in the toolbox for achieving that action. I can't imagine doing climate action without a greenhouse gas inventory.
Yeah, I would say that we did our greenhouse gas inventory with the ICLEI Clear Path tool, and they have a protocol that's associated with that. So there are some ground rules, and then there are parts of it that I think are more reliable in terms of numbers than others. Like when you get into what electricity are you using or energy are you directly using, and what are you buying, like scope 1 and scope 2. There's usually smaller error bars around those things because you have some idea of what your utility mix is and what that would generate in terms of greenhouse gases. As you get to transportation and you're estimating vehicular traffic numbers, or you're getting numbers that for us, for example, represent some of the roads in our city, but those are difficult to get exactly at our boundaries, you get into bigger error bars. And I think going back to your earlier point, Marty, about what are you concerned about, what can you influence, what can you control, those would be important things when working with staff to get an inventory that's useful to you, because you might get an inventory of a lot of things that are not of concern to you. And I think when you hear 3 different ways of doing it, if we all did it the same way, with the same methodology, we might come up with the same answers, but we're interested in different things, which is part of the reason why you're hearing 3 different ways of doing it. Not because it's impossible for us to do it the same way, but what's useful to us is different.
This may be a total no-brainer for everyone in this room too, but methodologies will change from year to year as the protocols change. Make sure you document the sources of the inventory, because I think so many times you look back at an old inventory and you're like, where did this number come from? I don't know. 2 sustainability coordinators ago came up with it somehow. And so just making sure that you're documenting the sources and assumptions in the inventory can help improve the comparison from year to year. I think we probably have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Sure. First of all, great discussion. Thank you. And a lot of great discussion around the co-benefits. One way I think about it is mitigation and adaptation.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm not quite sure. I'm searching for the question here. It's on the tip of my tongue. But it has something to do with taking a greenhouse gas inventory and somehow filtering it through another tool or sustainability plan to identify those measures that not only reduce emissions but have significant adaptation benefits. Because I feel like that's going to be the difference maker at the decision maker level, where it's like batteries, they're going to help with the renewable grid, but they'll also save our butts in a big power outage. Are there any tools or ways of thinking about mitigation and adaptation together in that way?
I'll try to go first. For our community, I was just so proud of how our community development department really pushed us to talk to the other departments, and I think that's kind of where I think of adaptation is the sustainability department, climate action, whatever you might be, is depending on your electeds and political environment, maybe focused on more emissions, and that's a very lasered in focus. One way we're kind of thinking of adaptation is through our design guidelines, and through our Board of Zoning and Architecture Review Board. And our climate action plan supports them looking at more climate-friendly materials. That might mean that some of our design guidelines change so that historic buildings are allowed to use materials that are more fire resistant, even though it may not. We might have to modify those to look more historic. But that's an area where it can be really tough to think about adaptation, particularly in our community. I don't know. I'll add that.
That was good. For me, what comes to mind is where I don't know if you all know this. Local governments have plans. We have lots of plans. We make plans. And we follow through on those plans. And sometimes, various stages of plans. Anyway, I think a lot about how these plans, especially in the world of sustainability and climate action work, this interconnectedness, I think a lot about how these plans interrelate and fit in the hierarchy. And so in my mind, and this may be different for other communities, but our comprehensive plan, our strategic plan, and our sustainability plan are living at the top. And so that's where we start the conversation. And then the greenhouse gas inventory is kind of one tier down. It is a tool, a set of information, and some planning that has one specific thing that we're looking at, which is greenhouse gases. But so I get to the greenhouse gas benefits. I start at another place in the conversation on a project. And so, I'll go back to e-bikes just because I had that example earlier. We want to do this. It has equity benefits. I don't know if it has resiliency benefits, maybe, but or battery storage. This has resiliency benefits, and it has greenhouse gas benefits. So I would say I rarely start a project from the greenhouse gas impacts. It's a next level down in the planning.
Yeah, I think it gets back to that co-benefits thing, and I think of it a little bit like, some sort of Venn diagram of you might use the priority levels of things that you've identified in your greenhouse gas inventory. You might start somewhere else, but at some point you're recognizing projects have multiple benefits, and the ones you pursue might be the ones that are accumulating the most. And part of that's greenhouse gases, but part of it might be some sort of housing affordability or flood mitigation or fire mitigation, different concerns of resilience or adaptation for your community. And you could create a whole new plan, but also sometimes those things are around and what these issues of concern are, and you can kind of pull together a project based off of the resources you have and the meshing of those concerns.
I think that's all we got. And thank you three for doing this. I feel genuinely very lucky to work with these people, and thanks for everyone for coming and chatting with us.
Thanks for